Hi, my name is Josephine Tan, and I want to thank you for having me at this Japan regional meeting. Before I begin, I'd like to give you some background information about myself to give some context to this presentation. I am a tenured clinical psychology faculty at Lakehead University in Canada. One line of my research is on suicide among Indigenous people in Canada, and I've been working in the area of suicide among Inuit for a number of years. I'm also a clinical psychologist in practice, working with Indigenous people who come with intergenerational trauma. So the information I share with you today comes from what I have learned from my research, from research that were done by other people, as well as from my own experience working with the Indigenous people who have been really wonderful teachers to me. For my talk, I'd like to start off with an introduction of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. Then I'll go into the health issues. Then I'll go over the factors that contribute to the health disparity, and followed by the Indigenous concepts on health and healthcare. And then I will wrap up this presentation by giving some thoughts of my own about the implications for psychology. So there are three main groups of Indigenous peoples in Canada: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. For the First Nations, they are actually the biggest group. They live mostly in southern part of Canada. About half of them live on reserves and the other half live off reserves. Métis is the next biggest group. They are the descendants of First Nations and early Europeans who came to Canada for the fur trade. They also live on reserve as well as off reserve. Inuit is the smallest group, and they live mostly in the Arctic and the subarctic areas of Canada. On this slide, you see a number of Indigenous health issues. There definitely is a significant disparity in health and well-being between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So when you look at this list here, you can see that the Indigenous individuals tend to suffer more from chronic illnesses like diabetes, heart disease, and hypertension. There's poor maternal and infant health. Substance and prescription drug abuse is a major problem, a major concern, particularly among First Nations. Suicide is also another major concern, particularly among Inuit. And then there's interpersonal violence, incarceration, involvement with child welfare. The Indigenous communities also suffer from food safety issues. There's not enough nutritious food, and food is also pretty expensive where they live. There is inadequate housing. Either there's not enough housing or the housing is of poor quality. So there tends to be living in overcrowding situations. They also have poverty in many cases, low access to education, low access to employment, and also discrimination. Now, I don't want to give you the picture or the impression that all Indigenous communities are like that, because that is certainly not the case. There are, some Indigenous communities that are better off and others that are worse off. Those who live in the rural and remote communities tend to have more of the problems. And the other thing too that we need to keep in mind is that the Indigenous communities did not always have all these problems. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the Indigenous peoples were independent, they were self-governing, the communities were healthier. But then after the Europeans arrived, the Indigenous societies experienced geographical dislocation and social and cultural disintegration. And all of that are associated with the numerous health and social problems that we see today. So when you look at the factors related to health disparity, cultural discontinuity is definitely top of the list. The government tried to prevent the transmission of culture among the First Nations, particularly by creating the residential school system. And this is where the children were taken away from the families, away from the communities, and then they were placed in residential school. And the intent actually was supposed to be to assimilate the indigenous children. It so happens, unfortunately, that in a number of those schools, there was widespread abuse, neglect, and maltreatment. And the children, eventually, many of them turned to drugs and alcohol to help them cope with pain and trauma. And many of them, after they left the school, found themselves homeless or living in poverty. Many of them had encounters with the law, got into trouble with the law. And when they got married and they had children, they found it very difficult to provide a stable and nurturing environment for their own children because they were raised by a residential school that was punitive and abusive. So they didn't have good parental role models, which they would have had they stayed with their own parents. But instead, they were placed in schools that were punitive and abusive. Then that is the 60s school. So between the 1960s and the 1980s, thousands of indigenous children were taken from their homes. That was done by the child welfare workers. They were placed with foster families, and that led to destruction of the indigenous family ties. Because the foster families, some of them didn't even know that the children they were fostering were indigenous. The government also established the Indian Act that made the government the guardian of the indigenous people. And through this act, the non-indigenous society came to control indigenous peoples. So indigenous people lost their autonomy as a result. Now, this act has been amended several times, but to this day, it remains very controversial. The government resettled Inuit in the Arctic, and that changed the Inuit life dramatically and rapidly. Inuit was used to moving around. They were not locked into a specific spot. So the Inuit people found that it was very hard to engage in the traditional methods of subsistence because they had to travel long distances to find animal resources when they were placed in a fixed settlement. They also found it difficult to adapt to a Western style of living, living in Western styled homes and having to take on a job that's from 9 to 5, where you get a monthly wage. So even the economic system for them turned out to be very different once the government became involved and they were resettled. At this point, I'd like to take a look at the Western and indigenous concepts of health and wellness. So if you look at, at what I presented here on this slide, on the left, that's the Western model, and on the right is the indigenous model. And you can see that they are quite different. So for the Western models, we tend to be very individualistic. In our models, we separate the mind and the body. We talk about illness, so we are focusing on deficits. We talk about what is wrong with a person. So when it comes to etiology of poor health or mental illness, we look from the inside. There's something wrong with the person. And we value empiricism and hard data. The indigenous people, the way they think is, they tend to be more holistic, and they look at interconnections. They see everything as interconnected. They see the self as being connected to all things in all activities. They focus on wellness. They talk about strengths and resilience. When it comes to etiology, they look for factors that are outside of the person. So it could be factors that could be social or cultural or historical, community or family in nature. And they value traditional knowledge and they value experience as well. The First Nations conceptualize health as a balance among 4 domains that are represented by the medicine wheel that you see on this slide. So you have 4 dimensions. They represent the mental, the physical, the spiritual, and the emotional. To have health means you need to balance and you need to have harmony among these 4 dimensions. To adopt a holistic life and to achieve a balance among the physical, the mental, the emotional, and spiritual, you have to empower the person in all these 4 dimensions. So physical empowerment may take the form of eating well, having a healthy diet, taking your medicine, and doing exercises, hunting, being on the land. Mental empowerment includes learning the traditional teachings, finding out what triggers you to be upset, perhaps, and having dream interpretations, vision quests, and so on. Emotional empowerment consists a lot of seeking support systems, seeking support from others, providing support to other people, controlling your anger, taking pride in First Nations identity and culture. And in that way, the individual will reaffirm the self-worth. And then there is a spiritual empowerment that can be achieved through meditation or prayer, consulting the elders and the traditional healers, engaging in traditional cultural activities. For Inuit, there really is no term for mental health or mental illness. The closest that comes to it, is the phrase thinking too much or not thinking at all. In 2014, ITK came up with a report that identified 11 factors that were contributing to ill health and suicide among Inuit. ITK is a national organization that represents the interests of Inuit. So if you take a look at this slide, what you're seeing here is the factors are all situational, environmental, outside of the person. So you're looking at unemployment, lack of access to educational opportunities, poverty, high cost of living. Again, we get into housing problems, homelessness, personal safety issues such as interpersonal violence, low access to health care, poor food security. They also worry about climate change and environmental contaminants. And also they worry very much about the decline of the culture and the use of their Inuit language. Now, Nunavut is a territory in Canada, and majority, over 80% of the residents there are Inuit. The territory of Inuit adopted a set of Inuit values that I've listed here for you. So again, when you take a look at these values, you see how it is very communal, is very much focused on relationships and the environment. So the values call for respecting other people, caring for other people, fostering good spirits, welcoming, inclusive of other people, serving your family, providing for your community. And if there are decisions to be made, do it through discussion and consensus. Develop your skills through observation, mentoring, practice, and effort. Get together and work together for a common cause. Be innovative and resourceful, and respect and care for the land, for the animals, and for the environment. The Inuit very, very much values their connection with the land. For them, the land is a healthy space. And when they look at the wide expanse of land and sea, it gives them a sense of peace. It reduces their sense of distress and anxiety. For them, the land is a reminder of their cultural history, of the travel routes, and that forms what we call, an Inuit memoryscape. So the landscape for them is tied into personal memories of what they did, who did what and where, and is also tied into highly valued activities such as hunting. And hunting, for many Inuit men, it gives them a good sense of self-esteem. It gives them a sense of providing for the family. Skills related to living on the land is seen as a source of strength and resilience. It teaches you to be patient, teaches you to be courageous in the face of pressure, to focus, persevere, and to exercise sound judgment. And being on the land, hunting, fishing, camping, all of that can rejuvenate your body and your mind. It creates a sense of well-being. It gives you time to yourself to slow down and think and to work through difficult feelings. Now, healthy communities have markers of cultural continuity. And this was a research that was done by Lalonde and Chandler. And they essentially, a healthy community have settled their land claims, they have self-government, they are in charge of their own education services, police and fire services, health services, and they have cultural facilities. In other words, when you look at that list, what it says is that a healthy community is one that has autonomy, and they can make their own decisions, and they can make decisions for what they want in the future for the young. So next, we take a look at Indigenous healing. What does that look like? Indigenous healing involves talking, developing secure relationships, connecting with the land, sharing your life stories, being in a healing circles where everybody listens to one another with a great deal of respect and caring, engaging in traditional rituals and ceremonies that perpetuate your culture, and also adopting explicit values to guide living. Remember, I said that suicide was a major problem among Inuit, and the ITK, in response to that, in 2016, came up with a national Inuit suicide prevention strategy. And they identified 6 priority areas that needs to be looked at in order to tackle the problem of suicide. So here they are on the slide. They call for the creation of social equality, creating cultural continuity, and raising healthy children, and ensuring that Inuit have access to a whole variety of mental wellness services when they need it. As well, trauma and grief is prevalent among Inuit, and those unresolved trauma and grief needs to be healed. Inuit also have a great deal of very good traditional knowledge relating to resilience and suicide prevention. And so ITK calls for such knowledge to be mobilized. So when you look at all of these, what are the implications for psychology if you want to work on Indigenous health? First, I think it is so important for us to consider historical, cultural, social, and political influences when we work with Indigenous populations. We have to be informed, we have to be respectful of the Indigenous perspectives and their ways of knowing. And it is also very important that we do not impose Western paradigms on Indigenous populations, because that would be a form of continued colonialism and forced assimilation. Also be aware that Indigenous knowledge, practices, and interventions might be more appropriate in many situations. Also, use the two-eyed seeing method. The two-eyed seeing method involves seeing through one eye the strengths of indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing. Then through the other eye, you see the strengths of Western knowledge and ways of knowing. So then you use both eyes together and you utilize the strengths of both systems for the benefit of all. And that is applicable to all psychological activities such as teaching, training, research, and practice. Humility is also a really, really important rule I think we all need to follow. We do not fully understand indigenous culture. They understand it better than we do, even for somebody like me who has been working for several years with them. So I do a lot of consultation and collaboration with traditional healers and knowledge holders. As well, decisions about indigenous issues are best made by indigenous peoples because they know what is best for them. Indigenous people will make the decision and they will decide what they need to work on. On this slide, I have provided a list of references that I use to create my talk. And you're certainly welcome to take a look at them and contact me if you have any questions. So on this next slide, I have provided my email address if anyone wants to get in touch with me, and I want to thank you so much for listening.